So I hope that people were able to follow a little bit of the incredible mobilizations that happened in South Africa last year. I'm going to just try and give a very brief account of the events that took place and then try to draw out maybe a few of the lessons that might be relevant for your struggle today. The uprising began in March at the University of Cape Town with a movement that demanded the removal of the statue of the colonizer, Cecil John Rhodes. But despite what many of its detractors said, this was not a movement that was simply about statues, but about the structural racism that continues to divide South African society. To give just one indication of this, the University of Cape Town is still a stronghold of the white liberal establishment. It's a university that 20 years after democracy cannot claim to have one single black female professor. And so this movement was able to tap into very deep sentiments of anger felt by black students, particularly black working class students, at the ongoing exclusion at this university. And it raised a range of demands around transformation, around fees issues, around language policy, around curriculums, and very importantly around the situation of workers on campus who had been subject to 20 years of ongoing precariousness, mainly through outsourcing. So this was a struggle that they saw fundamentally about the decolonization of the university. The response of the university administration was this predictable mixture of reform and repression. They gave in very quickly and removed the statue, but they deflected the much more substantive issues of transformation, and at the same time they tried to arrest and to exclude and to repress the leaders of the movement. At the same time, the movement spread very quickly to other campuses in South Africa and even around the world, including to a major struggle that's taking place at Oxford University. In the months that followed, students remained organized in kind of decentralized networks. They continued to campaign, and they began a very profound process of political consciousness raising with ongoing occupations, seminars, discussions, debates, and which basically changed the political mood amongst the youth in South Africa completely and contributed to an ongoing process of radicalization in the society and a process of struggle against a very deep social crisis that affects all layers. So this was the situation, the very volatile situation in which the government effectively threw a match in October of 2015 when they attempted to raise student fees by more than 10%. This wasn't a new move by the government, it was just the latest in an ongoing process of marketizing universities, of defunding them, of squeezing students, forcing them into higher debt, and of forcing workers into terrible conditions and precariousness. But the situation had changed, and this time it led to an enormous reaction from students. The leaders of the decolonization movement were at the forefront, but it drew in a much wider layer of political currents of other students who immediately called for the occupation of campuses around the country. As we've seen very often recently, brutality from the police and from private security played a role early on in changing the protests and turning them to a mass dynamic. So this led more or less directly to a huge action of more than 7,000 students outside the parliamentary building to confront the Minister of Education. But the key day of action took place exactly a week after the first announcement of the fee increase at the executive building of the government, where the president was meeting with the university administrations and the education ministers, and 15,000 students from across the country, supported by workers and supported by left movements, gathered outside. That meeting finished by deciding that there would be no fee increase after all. But the most inspiring events took place the next day, where meetings across the country, the majority of the students, or at least its most radical layers, voted to continue the occupation until the demands around workers' conditions and around outsourcing had been met. And in the weeks that followed, most of the major universities in the countries announced that they would be insourcing workers again, employing them directly with much better pay and better conditions. So if I can just try to draw out briefly a few lessons from this. The first is a very simple point about the power and the effectiveness of mass direct action and mass organization. There had in fact been, for the last 20 years, isolated small struggles against outsourcing and against fee increases, but these never succeeded in connecting across campuses and across regions and affecting a mass base. And this meant that university administrators were able to sell the story of scarcity, to claim that there wasn't enough money, there wasn't the resources to give students an affordable education or workers a decent wage. But when there were 15,000 students gathered outside the union buildings, running pitch battles with the police, it took a matter of hours for the president and the university administrators to decide that actually the money was there. When students decided that they would not let business continue as usual, when they continued the occupations and the blockades, it took a matter of weeks for universities to decide that there was enough money to employ workers on decent conditions. So struggles that had gone on for decades were won in a matter of weeks. But it's important to emphasize that the effectiveness was not just in struggle as an instrument, but in the process of struggle, in the changes that it affected in its participants, and the way they began to see society differently, and their new engagement with radical movements across the society. So the second point I wanted to make, something that seems very relevant today, I think what you're calling the convergence of struggles, it's the natural alliance between workers and students. When students first gathered to express their alienation at the university, workers were immediately there from day one, and they saw in the struggle of the students their own interests. And it didn't take long for the students to realize these common interests, to include workers' demands on their platforms, and to build strong alliances that were able to resist the attempts by the university administrators to say that their interests were opposed, that we couldn't afford both lower fees and decent wages. And I think this was critical, not just in amplifying the power separately of each of these struggles, but in their mutual engagement in forcing people to think about the broader connection of what was happening at this university to how we want to change society generally. Okay, I wanted to make a few more points, but I think as time is thin, I'm just going to leave you with a quote from Fanon, which has been used very often in the South African struggles. He said very simply that it is the task of every generation to find its political permission and to fulfill or to betray it.